A very happy New Year to you. It's a big day for us today, as my invitation letter mentioned to you. We start with this absolutely fascinating theme that Israel Carbonet would be discussing with us this morning on development models and humanitarian assistance. So bringing in development model, humanitarian partnerships in context of fragility, and of course the very idea of peace. So this trinity we would be discussing, but the day is absolutely fantastic for some of us who are interested in evolving the very ideas around development model. And from that point of view, this morning is a great beginning for us. It's a breakfast seminar series of RIS under which we have done several lectures, but let me mention it to you that this is the first breakfast seminar which is at this level, and usually we are crammed in RIS conference room, which of course we are growing out of, and we have been thinking of shifting to Habitat or to a little larger room. So that I think is a good beginning in the new year. We are also happy later in the day around 11 o'clock with DFID, RIS would be launching or extending this exercise for bringing out the idea of our alternate narrative on development and how we can contribute through empirical evidences that are coming out of experiences of non-Anglo-Saxon region, and how that contribution can bring in what has been discussed in Europe and in many places as alternative take on Washington consensus. So that is going to be absolutely fascinating afternoon. And then, of course, later in the day, we go back to Africa. We would have the Deputy Foreign Minister of South Africa and a very rich panel to talk about India-Africa partnership, and then with Haiti we close the day. So it's a very hectic day. As you know, the breakfast seminar is for around half an hour with the speaker, and then we give equal time for discussion. And today we are starting at 9 and we would close around 10 or so. We can also have an extended. We have some time in between till the 11 o'clock, so we can have some extended discussion. We are also very fortunate that today we are joined in by Dr. Yasmin Ali Haq, the coordinator at this point for the UN, but she is a well-known face in India with those who are engaged with UNICEF. And her humanitarian concerns are very well known. She joined UNICEF in 2017 in Delhi, and she has served as Deputy Director of Emergency Program of UNICEF headquarters in New York, where she played a lead role in coordination of emergency programs and policies for effective UNICEF strategy. Dr. Haq served as the first UNICEF representative to South Sudan. Her previous positions include UNICEF representatives to Ghana from 7 to 10. So several missions she has served of UNICEF. And yesterday when I mentioned about this, couple of my colleagues were inquiring which country she's from. And they were thinking that with this name, probably she's from West Asia or from North Africa. And then I asked her just now, so those who are sitting at the back who inquired, and they are waving from there, they inquired, and I think you would be glad to know that she's from Bangladesh. So that would be great. Now, Madam, may I request you to chair the proceedings and introduce our great speaker, Israel Carbonet, and set the ball rolling. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, Professor, and it's always a pleasure to be at an event where we're covering such a wide scope of what people face. And Gilles is going to do us a big favor. He's going to bring the different pieces that Professor Chaturvedi talked about together and make sense of it for human development, for reaching the SDGs throughout the world. I asked Gilles how he would like to be introduced and what his passions are, and I think his passion really is research and teaching on international development. He has been elected the Vice President of the International Committee of the Red Cross in April 2018. But he comes with a wide experience of serving as an ICRC delegate in a number of countries, and there looking at what is happening around him, developing an understanding and a curiosity around the dynamics of human development, even in conflict situations, and the economies that go along with conflict. He has been a professor of development economics at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies since 2007. He has really taken a keen interest in the whole domain of political economy of conflict and humanitarian crises. As for his non-academic passion, he's in the place now where he is really getting to experience more of Indian classical music, which he loves very much. We'll turn to Gilles to hear from him, his thinking and his experience on the whole issue of what development models can we be looking at that would leave no one behind and really address the issues that people face in humanitarian crises. So over to you, Gilles. Let's give him a good round of applause.
Madam Chair, dear Dr. Hake, Mr. Director General, dear Professor Chaturvedi, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, very good morning. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to address this very distinguished audience on the question of development models that might apply in fragile contexts, in the context of armed conflicts, armed violence. And I'm delighted to do so here at RIS, which is certainly one of the leading policy and development think tank in India. And I want to thank RIS for the invitation and the organization of this breakfast exchange. And I very much look forward to the conversation with you. And I'm also very glad to hear about the very exciting program that you had during the day. I was thinking it's a pity I cannot attend the whole day, because I'm sure that discussing also about critical issues related to South-South cooperation and to different development engagement and models will be extremely exciting. My topic will be a bit more modest. I will focus mainly on what it means to push a development agenda in the places where it is most difficult, which is mainly in the countries and regions where we have armed conflicts, armed violence, and fragile institutions. And I would contend that this is actually one of the most critical issues for achieving the SDGs, because time and again, research and reports show that, for instance, very recently, a report by the Overseas Development Institute was showing that as far as now, 82% of the SDGs, we are off track when we look at fragile and conflict-affected countries, meaning only 18% of the targets are on track, more or less, and this is certainly where it will be most challenging to achieve the SDGs. So with that, I'd like to discuss a bit the idea pushed forward 2 years ago and last year by the UN Secretary General to say we have to really have a triple nexus between humanitarian action, development, and peace. and bring this together in a consistent framework, and actually to do three good things at a time: humanitarian interventions and action, development, and peace. So what is the potential of bringing a triple nexus that actually works and leaves no one behind? But what are also the shortcomings of this model, and how we, the International Committee of the Red Cross, but more broadly, how economists and development professionals can really go about the shortcomings and trying to make it work for everyone. So, needless to say, when we speak of fragile and conflict-ridden contexts, we are speaking of about 2 billion people being affected. We have last year a record high of 69 million people forcibly displaced, about 25 million refugees, and just in 2017 alone, 16 additional forcibly displaced people. So what we see is that armed conflict can very quickly reverse former development gains. If we look at the Human Development Index of, let's take Yemen, in just 4 years, Yemen has slipped back 20 years in terms of HDI. If we look at Syria, it was just in 2 years that Syria lost 20 years of progresses in Human Development Index. So we see that this is there where we have prime territory for nexus between humanitarian intervention, humanitarian action, development and peace, in a global development landscape that is fast changing. And there is a paradox, ladies and gentlemen, between the bad news that we hear in terms of the impact of armed conflict and fragility, and the very good news that we see globally with great advances in reduction of extreme poverty, thanks to rapid and solid economic growth in major countries, including India and China, but also technological advances that allow to leapfrog some of the development stages that we were used to learn about in the 70s, 80s, and even 90s. We have a new geography of poverty, where if you look back at the end of the Cold War, 80% of the poor were living in low-income countries, and 20 years later, 80% of the poor were living in middle-income, richer countries. So we have seen a relative decline in inequality between nations, but an increase in inequality within nations. And I think that in this framework, the SDGs can be seen as a new social contract among nations, but also between states and their peoples. We heard yesterday at the opening of the Raisina dialogue, the Prime Minister of Finland, and she was saying, well, in my country, which is often ranked, or Prime Minister of Norway, sorry, of Norway, and she was saying, well, my country often ranks first on the HDI, but still, we are not done with the SDGs. We have many things to do to achieve the SDGs in Norway. I come from Switzerland. We have reports, yearly reports on advances, and we are off track on quite a number of targets, especially those targets regarding ecological sustainability, urbanization, and the question of also inequality within the country. So, with that, let me focus now on conflict-affected and fragile contexts. You might remember that Kofi Annan, when he was launching the Millennium Development Goals at the Millennium Declaration, he famously said there can be no development without security, and conversely, you can have no security without development. And I think the idea of a triple nexus that Antonio Guterres brought forward very much relates back to this notion, but it includes, beyond humanitarian action and development, the notion of peace as a central element. The assumption behind may be quite simple. The assumption is that you need development to spur peace and to achieve sustainable peace. And humanitarian action can help and sustain development in conflict and fragile environments. So this is the overall assumption that is behind the idea of the triple nexus. And we see in practice ever more linkages being done between different silos, between the silos of the investor community, the aid community, and within the aid community, the silos between humanitarian aid and development assistance, and I think this is most welcome. Now, there are many positive aspects to the triple nexus, because indeed, if you can do 3 good things in one stroke, why not? But there are a number of shortcomings, and I think that we have to focus a bit more on the shortcomings and how we can address those shortcomings. First, we have to disentangle the assumptions. Poverty is not the only root cause of conflict and violence, and we can see that it is not a linear process where development does not always guarantee peace. And indeed, we have seen armed conflict emerging ever more frequently in middle-income countries, Syria being one example. A recent research published by the UN and the World Bank under the title Pathways for Peace looked at how various countries were able to prevent conflict and violence and why others fell prey to conflict. And one of the major findings is that perceptions of exclusion